You've got business users all over the place wanting different products and ideas. It's hard. The workplace can be really challenging. So I hope today I can provide some benefit or value to maybe simplify things. We can make things overly complex when they don't need to be, especially in the world I live in. And creating some clarity, I think, is a really important path forward for people to create some calmness in their workspace. So let's first just review the Seductive Seven. Today, I'm really going to focus on one of them, which is technology. Here they are up on the screen. And as a reminder, these came to me as I was oversaw the budget for the state of Utah, and we get a lot of budget requests, and I was in the money a lot. And I would start seeing people come and ask for money, but I'd see these trends starting to pop up. They would jump to certain solutions pretty consistently when they were trying to solve a problem. And you can list them here. They thought they needed more money, they needed more data, more IT, one more strategic plan, even though the last 10 didn't really make an impact. Maybe a reorg would somehow magically solve the problem. You can listen here, more training. We just trained our people more, it solved the problem. Now, I'm not going to go into all of these today. I'm going to focus on technology. And the caveat here, it's not that these things are necessarily bad. They're just tools, they're inputs. But they by themselves don't solve the problem, right? They're just tools. And it's getting to the deeper question of what's the real problem we're trying to solve. It really simplifies sometimes this chaotic world we can live in. So let's just talk about technology. So I have an actual case study in a little book I wrote, and I'm going to use this one as an example. And this is very common in government. So a certain state purchased a $200 million IT system. And this IT system promised to do many, many beautiful things, right? It was going to create a rules-based system. So essentially all the complex policies and things like that were behind the scenes, it would just check for those. It would help do automate the calculations. You probably hear this a lot. They need to modernize their systems and their infrastructure. They were working out of 5 different quote unquote legacy systems. So they were having to go into 5 systems to get the data they need. And the system did what we call eligibility. They determined if people are eligible for Medicaid, or what we now call SNAP, which is then food stamps, or TANF, which is the new version of welfare. It was a lot of programs for low-income vulnerable populations, long-term care assistance, to see if these people qualified. So you think, well, all of that sounds great, doesn't it? It had the latest, coolest stuff you can imagine, right? Everything you could hope to have, $200 million. Well, by the way, $200 million, they could double the size of their staff for 10 years for $200 million. We often don't see the opportunity cost. The question is that really the problem to solve? Management perceived the problem as a lack of technology, a lack of automation. Somehow, if they just brought automation to the system, it would improve the world. Well, many of you in this world, even coming from the Agile world, you're very founded in the whole idea of user stories and the customer experience. So let's dig a little deeper and think about, is that really the problem to solve? Is that the problem that was most important for the customer? Well, it turns out that actually that's not the case. Usually in these systems, it can take about 30 days to process an application and make a decision. We call that the elapsed time. But the touch time, the time it actually takes for somebody to work on the work, to do the job, if they had all the information they needed from the client, how long would it take him to make a decision? On average, about 30 minutes. Some cases are a little more complex, some are very simple, but on average, 30 minutes. So you have a 30-day elapsed time, and you have 30 minutes of time that the person's actually working. We could go into that and just tell you all the red flags and why that's a problem, what's even going on in that. But what's interesting is all the technology, what was it fixing? It was fixing the 30 minutes, not the 30 days, right? The technology. So now I don't have to go into 5 systems, I go into 1. Okay, let's say that takes 5 minutes off my touch time. And let's say the rules-based just flows it through, so I don't have to look at all the rules or look up stuff. Great, that takes off another 5 minutes. So, you can maybe touch and make some marginal impact on the 30-minute touch time. But the 30 days, why is work stuck in the system? Why is it taking so long to make a decision when we know the touch time's 30 minutes? The real problem wasn't a lack of technology, automation, or legacy systems. The real problem was in the flow, how the actual system was designed. So for example, somebody would they have a case. Let's say Todd is applied, and there's 10 documents that Todd needs to make a decision. The worker, every time that the system was designed to force the worker to do this. Every time Todd would submit one of those 10 required pieces of information, the worker would go in, check it, see, look at it, say, oh, wait, there's still 9 more pieces of information that we need. The person goes out. Then all day they're doing is just bouncing around from case to case to case. This is just one of some of the process issues that were going on. Instead of what we call a full kit, only letting the people work on the cases that had all the information they needed, right? So Todd, instead, in the real world, Todd submits all the information. When that's submitted, it signals to the frontline worker, this case is green, work on this. So it becomes a pull system, right? The person grabs it, makes a decision, moves on, grabs it. Otherwise, they're wasting all of their time, and we could get into the concept of bad multitasking and the negative, significant, horrendous impacts that has on our organizations and our performance. But the IT system didn't even look at the flow. Why are things taking so long? Why don't we have standard work? Why don't we have good full kit? How do we control how much work is led into the system, right? Where is work getting stuck? Why is it getting stuck? What policy is making it get stuck? These are all business problems. Technology is a tool. It can be fantastic and powerful only once we understand the real problem we're trying to solve. And by the way, the real problem we are solving is not a lack of technology. Again, technology can harden, it can help, it can automate, it can simplify, it can do amazing things. But what are we anchored in? And if we don't understand this, we get all into the Seductive Seven. So let me give you another example. This is an actual RFP, request for bid. It's a bid, basically, government bid, request for proposal for a major, what we call a Medicaid Management Information System, MMIS. And I don't want to like bang New York, because this is pretty common across the country, and we spend billions and billions of dollars on these systems across the country. You could take this RFP and probably look at every other state, and it'd be pretty similar. So here's the RFP. I want you all to take a look at it for a second. There's 2 pages on this, and I want you to ask the question, what's the problem this group is trying to solve? What's their objective or their goal? See if you can find that anywhere here. And good luck, by the way.
Implement.
I'll give you like a minute or so to read this. And you read it, and when you're done, you tell me.
It's on page 2 now.
Okay, we're on page 2. You read it, and then you tell me. I don't know how long it takes you sighted people to read stuff. You're in? Okay.
About claims.
And yeah, all right. So what do you think? Like, what's the problem they think here that they're solving with this is probably going to be, my guess, when they're said and done, the feds usually pay 90%, states 10%. This could be a $300, $400 million system when they're all said and done, I would suspect, maybe 200 if they're lucky. What do you think? What are they trying to solve here?
Enhanced functionality, provider servicing, paying claims?
Yeah. I mean, so super interesting, right? So first of all, they're about to launch. And by the way, this RFP, if you keep reading it, has pages and pages of technical requirements. So the bureaucracy here is trying to basically ensure that their rules can be complied with, right? And that the functionality to do, in this case, dentistry, to bring on providers for dentistry happens. But it's very an internal thing. What's so interesting about this RFP is that it's not clear what the problem is, right? Like they're about to launch this massive, expensive project that will harden in behaviors and how people work for years. And there's no clarity on the problem we're trying to solve, but more importantly, for whom are we trying to solve the problem? Very often especially in this case, it's very inward focused. Really, when you look at these systems, very compliance focused, a lot of policies, procedures, utilization rates, people can apply, but it's very complex. And IT is challenging because it allows us to hold complexity. We can issue endless policies and things like that because the technology allows for it, right? There's no constraints to constrain the amount of policy that goes out. So we actually allow for complexity with technology. And so this system, like many systems, likely will make zero impact at the end of the day about access or quality or things like that. So the real question is, why do we get lost in our bureaucracies? Why is it so hard to figure out what's the problem we're trying to solve? Now, for me, if I was over the system and I'm over Medicaid, which is access to healthcare for low-income individuals, my first priority would be this. Who's my primary customer? The patient. Who's the strategic customer? Who's the person that's got to like be successful and actually deliver or interface with my primary customer? The provider, the doctor. Now, how does my system solve the problem for the doctor and the patient? How do I actually give doctors more time back, not less? And if you actually look at some of the studies going on right now, some studies have come out and said that doctors spend half of their time, almost $500 million a year, on paperwork, right? So a lot of times these tech systems are helping the bureaucracy, but when we lose sight of who's our primary customer and what's their primary need, what's the most important thing they need, and we build a solution around that, we have a fighting chance to solve the problem. In my first example with the case management system, who's the primary customer? It's a low-income individual asking for benefits. Do they care if the system has 5 legacy systems? Do they care if it's a rules-based system? No. What do they care? They want to get their decision as quickly as they can, and they want it to be accurate, right? They don't want to like be denied if they're eligible, and if they're not eligible, they don't want to be told they're eligible and then have to, we have to come back and collect money from them because there's a bad decision made. That's what they want. But these systems often are designed without absolutely relentlessly being anchored in to the simple question: who's our primary customer? What's their primary need? Now, I threw out that term strategic customer. If you don't directly access your primary customer, there's somebody else that's involved with that. We call that a strategic customer. So juvenile justice services, your primary customer is the youth, the poor kid in detention, or out in the community, but you may contract out with a provider. So if the provider isn't successful, if I don't have a winnable game for the provider in my contracting mechanism, the ultimate customer is not going to win. So it sounds so simple, right? But common sense isn't common. And I have found in most of my work with IT systems and building technology or new automation solutions, it's very easy to get enamored with the prowess and the capacity and the potential of technology, but it's seldom really solving real problems for real people. Back in the state of Utah, when we started to look at this, started to analyze a lot of business cases coming into the IT shop. And I'd have to say the vast majority were not anchored in this. They used a lot of words around modernization, infrastructure, going digital, legacy, upgrading legacy systems, or new AI capabilities, or new predictive modeling capabilities, all of these cool buzzwords. But when you really say, what is the problem we're solving and for whom, we lose sight of that. And when we know what the primary customer's needs are, for example, let's say a patient needing quality care with the doctor, when our IT systems are actually allowing for complexity, that means we're often eating into the time and the capability and the capacity of the doctor to provide that really high quality service. So we want an anchor. We want a reference point for everything we do to say, look, I'm going to look back to this reference point to be my North Star. Am I on track or not? Is this really solving the problem that we care about? So, that sounds easy, but let's get real about this. Look at this next slide. This is IBM. I'll tell you the story about IBM. I didn't tell you guys this story before. I'm pretty sure I didn't. So you can look here. This is the S&P. You can see how IBM performed compared to everyone else on the S&P. Huge loss compared to where everybody else was gaining. The question is why? IBM back in the day, it was, I think, the 4th or 2nd largest company in the world back in the 70s. Huge global domination. It dominated so many different tech sectors, right? From processing to even personal computing was on the horizon. Just amazing stuff. And they had big investments in R&D. But what was interesting, their leadership started to shift their philosophical focus. Their primary customer started to shift from those of us using the service or organizations that purchase their products to shareholders. And their goals started to become more oriented to earnings per share for their shareholders. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be profitable, you should, but I think as you'll see, if you're seeing here, is long-term sustainable profitability exists when we're solving real problems for real people in big ways, right? Not just trying to maximize earnings per share. So they lost their way. And so to maximize earnings per share, what did they do? They started to dramatically cut their R&D budgets. When that happened, other companies like Apple and Intel started to dominate them, and Microsoft, right? When you looked at their R&D budgets compared to IBM back in the day, they're tiny. IBM shrunk, their R&D budgets grew, right? They're out there, how do we actually create new consumable products for the consumer that really provide value, remove significant limitations, make an impact? So IBM lost its way. Because it started to lose its way with R&D, it just wasn't competitive anymore. And they started to outsource their work outside of the country, and they started to become highly a service-focused organization where they would come in and maybe run your IT shop. And the consequences over decades of them losing their way is what you see here on the screen. Profitability is directly connected to your ability to remove a significant limitation for your primary customer. Something that people wish they could do and they can't because they're blocked. There's something preventing them, right? We have cell phones. We wish we could just talk to people wherever we want to. Cell phones created. We wish we could carry all this music with us. We can't because we can't handle 4,000 stereos with us. Now it's all in one little piece. So when we're solving real problems for real people in big ways, it's not just great for our customer, it's great for our long-term success for taxpayers who are government's version of shareholders because their ROI and it goes up and we need less revenue. And for shareholders, it's a big win. You capitalize your market, you're a more valuable product, you have bigger market share, you're creating new markets, you can actually charge premium for your product because it's so good and competitive. So this sounds so simple, but we can get so lost in our bureaucracy and the technical requirements and how cool the latest trend is of AI, and we lose our way. So how do we avoid this? Again, because this was one of, for me, when I look at the Seductive Seven, data and technology are just on the top of the list. What's the antidote to this? Now, how do we get out of this? So,
first of all, there's a chat.
Oh, there's a chat.
He said, this is Jonathan, he said, I think part of the reason we get lost.
Randy's reading me, Jonathan, what you said.
Who we were trying to serve is because we get distracted by the primary butt we're trying to cover.
Oh my gosh, CYA. Jonathan, have you lived my life? Right, it's very easy because we have ourselves and our bosses and our teams and there's CYA all over the place, right? It's very pervasive. What's really hard on the IT side is that the business can often throw to the IT side junk, right? Because the business hasn't done their due diligence and then they throw junk over to you guys, doesn't make an impact, and then business freaks out, so they ask for more changes, and we get into this vicious cycle of change, build, change, build, change, build, with the whole CYA in the background, and nothing changes. Nothing, the needle doesn't move. And in fact, in my world, if you're not getting a 20, 25%, 30% improvement in your work and your performance, you're solving the wrong problem. You're stuck in the cycle of making changes that don't make a difference. So this is not on the slide, but I'm just going to tell you, Dr. Goldratt had a great definition of value, and I've said it here. Oh, you just had it up? Oh, you saw the definition. I think it's really important to notice that definition. She remove a significant, not a small, not like we need another set of emojis, right? A significant limitation. And a limitation is interesting, right? Again, it goes to what's blocking people. What do they want to do? What do they wish they had? And they can't get it. So we remove a significant limitation, which is very different than just adding new functionality, right? You saw in that earlier RFP from New York. Yeah, let's add more functionality so that we can add dentists to our Medicaid menu of services. But that's not the problem. Dentists don't want to participate in Medicaid because the reimbursement rates are so low. So how do you fix that problem? You could do all the functionality you want all day, all night, but there's a deeper problem going on. The question is, why aren't people already doing this? What's blocking them from already doing this? So
we have the 4 key questions out. So who's the primary customer? What's the primary?
Oh, yeah.
Why can't the organization satisfy?
Yeah.
What's the problem?
So you can see these are the questions that we always want to ask. It always boils down to these 4 questions, but we'll just spend some time in the first 2. Who's my primary customer? What's their primary need? Again, we'll talk a little bit why can't the organization solve it, et cetera. So let's go into what we call the full kit. Yeah, I call it the full kit, but we call it the engagement model. I also sometimes refer to this as my North Star. When we have bosses pulling us in directions and our team and all this stuff, and that, the business side is giving you guys stuff to work on. My role working for different governors, there's a lot of stakeholders involved. There's the legislature, there are the agencies, employees, of course, obviously the governor I work for, the taxpayers, the customer. There's a lot of stakeholders, and sifting through all of that, knowing who's the one that's got the most skin in the game, where if this thing doesn't work, the whole thing falls apart. If I can't deliver for this person, all of our efforts, it doesn't matter. And that became a North Star for me and made it much easier for me to look at budget requests or proposals. And if that meant some people weren't always happy, it was okay, because I could stay pretty relentlessly focused on my North Star. And I'm not saying I was perfect with that for sure, right? It's an ongoing challenge. But for me, I'm going to tell you why I feel so passionate about this. And we'll get into the anecdote for getting into this model. So being blind, for a point in time in my life, it was long in my 20s. I was actually on Social Security disability insurance. Like I didn't have skills. I didn't know how to use technology or Braille or cane travel, all these little things we use as a blind person. And so I actually received government benefits for a bit. Something I wouldn't talk about in the past, but now I talk about it because I'm on the other side of it. And it was a really hard experience. And at the time I was going through this, government was doing a lot of stuff. They reorganized through legislation, to have one-stop centers for people, so you could just go to one place. They created like new strategic plans. I'm sure they had new data stuff too. I don't know about that, but I know they did new strategic planning. They had all these new technology, like case plans. So they had all these new versions of case plans you could do, and technology to support the case plans, and all of this stuff going on in the bureaucracy. Did I care about any of that? Do I really care as a blind person if they reorganize? Or do I really care if they set up a new data system, or if they've modernized their IT? Like, what's the problem for me as a blind person? At the time, now I can't speak for all blind people, although I have a pretty good belief in what I'm saying is true for most blind people, is that we had two big issues. One, our mindset, right? Like the belief that if you're blind, your life's over. And two, we didn't have I'd say three things, good skills, right? You've got to learn Braille, you've got to be able to be independent. And three, you've got to have opportunity to get jobs, right? A lot of blind people employers they don't understand blindness. It's scary for them. They don't know how to do it. Those are the things. Those are the things that matter. I don't need a reorg. I don't need a new data set. I needed that, right? That's what I needed, the essence of all of it. I didn't need a new version of the strategic plan or new technology for case management. I needed that. The question is, how does technology or data or anything like that support that fundamental need? So I feel very strongly about this because go get the dogs. Of course, Jonathan and I were talking earlier about managing our dogs, and of course, they're freaking out during the webinar. So what we really want to do, we may think we're customer centric, but I really want you to put yourself in your customer's shoes and ask, so what? If they're going to, and this isn't from me, this is from the CIO. He used to be the CIO of Tanner. He's just great, OC Tanner. So I'm borrowing the so what from him for full disclosure, but I loved it. So I'm going to quote him. Imagine if on the side of the freeway, there's a billboard and you put up there what you're working on right now in the world of IT. Would the customer care about it? Now, I know there's necessary things. There's infrastructure, security concerns. If we had more time, we could talk about how do you integrate that into a customer-centric environment. But the so what factor matters a great deal, because even if we're doing stuff that's okay, it's not bad, there's a huge opportunity cost. I know as a blind person, all the time and resources and money that was going on in government, the opportunity cost, I felt it, right? And I'm grateful that I had what I had. I'm just grateful to be in the United States as a blind person. So I'm grateful. I'm just saying they're high stakes. The consequences are real. There's an opportunity cost when we're not focused on our North Star. So how do we get out of this? So this is a set of questions we really believe, and we could go deeper into each of these, and there's stuff on infrastructure like that we won't get to today, but these are questions the business should be able to answer before launching into any IT project. And I'll walk through this, and then I'll walk you through an example. So the first one is, who's your primary customer, and what's your customer's primary need? Now, primary need is important because there are other needs. So let's say I'm a child welfare system, and there's two aspects of the child welfare system: making sure the kid is safe and free from abuse and neglect. And then there's this wellness, well-being, make sure the kid is doing well, however you define that. The wellness stuff sounds super fun, right? Make sure the kids get to school, they get to dentist visits. the abuse, neglect stuff is really hard burnout work. So it's easy sometimes to skip over this first thing and start working on the wellness side. But you're not going to work on wellness, which is a secondary need, if the kid's getting abused, right? We've got to get super, super good, reliable, and delivering on the first primary obligation and need that the person has. And then we're really good at that. We can earn our way into moving into secondary needs. And that's really important because we have finite time and resources. When we're spread thin across too many initiatives, we seldom can move the needle. And so when we really focus, or as Winston Churchill would say, concentrate our power into one area, we can make an impact there. And then we can go to the next one. But in my mind, you need to earn your way to secondary needs. If you cannot deliver on the primary need, you have no business going other places. And that depends on what your work is and what your product is and what you're doing. But every organization has got a customer with a primary need versus secondary and tertiary needs, et cetera. So, and by the way, when you really solve primary needs for your customers, it's a win for all your stakeholders, right? Because you've got to figure out how to do that in a way that your strategic customers win. You've got to do it in a way that's a win for your shareholders, right? If your primary customer wins in the long term, your shareholders will do well. As you know, you can see the IBM example of what not to do. So primary customer, primary need, really, really important. Next one, like, what's your goal? Now, that sounds pretty simple. A lot of time in the private sector, it's profitability. In government, it's not always so clear. I see organizations fall into a few really consistent traps with this one. I'll mention just a couple. One is we have very inward focused goals. In the private sector, it's about revenue and profitability, which is absolutely essential. I'm not saying that's not. You will for sure have financial targets. We have to have that in the budget office. But it's a very inward focused goal. And the ability to solve real problems for real people means you have goals for real people, right? So it could be, I hate to even use some of these examples because I don't want to shame anyone, but I would let's just take maybe economic development in government. Let me point the finger back at us. In economic development, it's very easy for states to have inward focusing goals about how much more revenue we'll get, how many more companies we'll attract. But that there's no problem to solve there. You know, if I'm trying to build out like the tech sector and I'm trying to figure out what's the tech sector's primary problem, why can't they grow? If I can actually help them, the byproduct of that is that I'll get more revenue as a state. But as soon as I'm inward focused, I'm not solving. It's a very practical, it's not just about philosophical, it feels good. It's very practical. If you want to be competitive or make a difference in government or in the private sector, you actually have to solve a problem for somebody who's real. And anchoring in that is really important. There's other traps people get into. We won't spend too much time. There's 4 of them. That one's very common in vague goals. We confuse the means with ends. I won't get into that too much, but you've got to have really good goals and really good ambitious targets. 2%, 3% not interested in. You may set an ambitious target around 2 to 3%. First of all, that's just normal fluctuation. That stuff just happens. You could have changes in seasonality or changes in your demographics of your customer base, and you're naturally will have fluctuations outside of what you do. What we're looking is for a real change that accounts for any variation in just in life. So that's why we like to set ambitious targets that are pretty high. And that's important because we want to force ourselves to think differently about the problem we have to solve. If I need to achieve a 50% growth, or actually, do more for less in government by 25%, I actually have to think about doing things differently. It's not just doing more of what I already do. It's actually about thinking about things differently. So that's really important. You could spend a lot of time on that one, but having really clear goals and ambitious targets is just the basis, because a problem is not a problem outside the context of the goal, right? I mean, if you're trying to train for a marathon so that you can win the marathon, that's going to force you to see the problem you need to fix in your training and your health regimen, right? If you're just going to do a walk around the block, it's a very different problem to solve. So a problem is a problem within the context of the goal. Next one is, GP, what's the next one?
The next one is,
Sorry, guys, I lost my focus. I know it goes PG. Oh, yeah, we did primary customer already. What was the P?
so there's primary customer, the goal. And then performance
Oh yeah, the
measures.
performance measures. Yeah, the performance measures is important. I've seen a lot of tech products. I'm sure all of you have seen that too, that they start and it's all again about the technical requirements and the cool new automation and everything we can do. And we've set the goal, but we don't have any what we call flow measures or process measures, performance measures. How are we going to know that the process itself is working well? How are we going to know if our return on investment is working well? And ultimately in this space, there's a few things I like to look at. I want to know, do I have more capacity? Does this IT system generate more capacity? Because that's what automation always promises, right? That you can do a lot more quicker. I want to know that. Don't just say that to me. Put numbers on a page. You can do 200 units an hour, and with the technology, you can do 400 units an hour. Let's get really clear on how this system is going to increase capacity. I also want to know quality, right? I don't want to just generate more capacity or what we call throughput without understanding the quality. How good is my product? How good is my service? Do I reduce recidivism by a certain amount? Am I going to actually capture more market share because of this? Will I have less call center calls because it's so good, the quality is so good. I don't have people calling my call center to figure out and complain or where's my package or anything like that. I want to know my quality is better. And you can have a few different aspects of quality, right? Reliability or timeliness or the outcome you want to achieve. But what is it? Because I've seen too often we throw money into the IT system and then it doesn't show up anywhere. Now we have maintenance and security costs and all change orders and bug fixes and patches. We have all these expenses now that have shifted into IT. And I don't know, for all the money put in there, are we better, faster, cheaper, right? Do you have more capacity? Is my quality better or cheaper, or my cost? Because technology is not free. So for all this new money I've spent, maybe I have the same amount of money going out the door, but I have more capacity. I can handle more customers. That's great. But very often I'll see in IT, the costs go in, and in one system we baselined, they were 18% worse after the investment. It was a $60 million IT system, which jacked up their cost. And for that investment, they weren't getting any more real capacity, and their quality was actually going downhill. So if you're going to say that the technologies matters, put your money where your mouth is. Show me. Now, if they're estimates, we know that no one's perfect. And you may say, we think it's going to hit, a 40% capacity, and you may get to 32 or 26 or whatever. But great. At least we know what we're getting for it, right? We've got to start constraining technology and making it accountable. We've got to start making technology accountable for delivering actual results for the people it's supposed to serve. So we look at those aspects. We also look at process measures. I'll show you a little bit about this in the case study or the example. But we want to know, in that first example, I talked to you about full kit, only having workers work on the work they should be working on. I want to know that 100% of the time, people are only working on full kit cases. Right? I never want anyone working on cases that don't have all the information, right? So if that's an important part of my process, my IT system better harden that behavior in and be able to tell me if that's happening or not. I want to know, I want to open up the black box of where we actually create the product or the service, and I want to know what's going on in there. Those are really important, what we call process or flow measures. Performance measures is another way to think of that. So show up when we're doing technology. Are we accountable about our investment? Now, on the IT side, sometimes business doesn't think about this, and the really great IT people I've seen excel in this space are able to help business verbalize and think through this, because they may not know or think about it. And the more you can help them, it's better for the business, but I also think it's better for your career, personally. You don't have to agree with me on that. Then we look at the scope. The scope of the system is, look, is this a mission? Is this about a primary customer issue that we're solving? Is it about our mission and we're actually going to show we're better, faster, cheaper? Or is this just like administrative? Like we've got to process payments or bills or whatever. And that's important because we want to know if we can just buy this off the shelf, just buy it off the shelf, right? We don't need to customize everything. People always think they're different. I always tell people you're special, but not unique. Some of these things that you do, just you don't need to over customize. So we do want to understand the scope, and we'll often add into here infrastructure, things like that, security. But we want to know, is this for the customer where we may need to think about some new product or innovation or some customization, or is this just something we can take off the shelf. We do not need to overthink this, right? We don't need to over customize everything. Then we want to look at the basic flow, and I'll show you an example of this in a second. But every environment, I don't care if you're in policymaking or you do actually build a product, or if you're in sales, or if you're into infrastructure and transportation, or child welfare. Every system has flow. I'll show you an example of this, but this is where we start to get behind the black box a bit and understanding, hey, we have this primary customer, we know what we want to do, we have these goals, but what's the process to make this actually happen? And we want to know that because technology should be helping us enable that process to be better, faster, cheaper. We do not want to harden in old behaviors, old patterns, old habits that aren't about what we call systems thinking, where we're fixing little pieces of the IT of the system, but the parts aren't designed to work together. So then we end up with friction points and rework, and work gets stuck, and there's poor flow. Whenever there's poor flow, your costs will go up, your quality will go down, and your ability to handle more work will go down. It creates a lot of friction point for your customer. They get frustrated. So flow is about the uninterrupted movement of work from one place to a next place with high quality. And we want to understand what that is before we start hardening in behaviors that we don't want to see in the system. So we do the flow, and then we look at the priority. And I have one more thing. Then we say to ourselves, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, it's its own webinar, but why can't the business or the organization deliver right now on this goal for this primary customer? What's blocking them? Sometimes you may have a capacity constraint. That's why we are going to start looking at your flow. Sometimes there may be a policy or procedure that's blocking you. You may have a problem in your market, like you have full capacity to build what you need and to deliver on that, but your real problem is in your market, right? And that's a problem. So we really want to understand that again, because we don't want to overcommit technology to fix something when it's not fixing the primary customer for the primary need and why the business can't deliver on that. So we do want to spend some time on that. Now, we don't have to do huge analysis. This isn't about 3 months of technical requirements analysis. This should be really basic, straightforward, concise language on what these issues are. Simple is hard, complex is easy. So we'll get to that in a second, but it's really important. You can see the language here. This is your slide, right? Yeah. You can see here, we want it to be very simple and straightforward. And we want to do this before we start handing it off for technical requirements and then into building. The last thing we want to do is build a system on a shaky foundation, or technology product on a shaky foundation. So then finally, we look at the priority. Many of you in the tech world, I'm sure, feel this thing of business throwing at you a lot of work, and everything's important, everything's critical, and there's 2 years of backlog change orders, and just goes on and on and on. It's really incumbent on the business side to work with technology to prioritize. And there's some interesting ways to do this. We won't get into too much, but we really believe in the concept that bad multitasking is really harmful. We want cultures of completion. We want to focus and finish our work. And so prioritization is really important. And there's ways to prioritize your work so that you're killing 2 to 3 birds with one stone. So for example, I may be building a product, and I know my customer, I know the primary need, I know the business problem, the business constraint. And I'm going to prioritize, but I also have infrastructure issues and security issues and all these other things I got to deal with. Well, instead of like spreading my infrastructure resources everywhere, if I'm going to climb into a system already to solve a problem for a primary customer, at that same time, I can focus my energy around that infrastructure that would support that piece of technology. So when I can basically weave all the elements of my technology portfolio into customer-centric solutions, I can hit infrastructure, security, customer concerns in one thing. Again, we won't get into too much detail on that, but there's ways to prioritize that can really help the organization stay very focused. And I love the term again by Churchill, to concentrate your power. If you have time, I'd love to do the bad multitasking exercise with them. Just less is more. Okay, the final one is prioritize, and then we, what's the budget? What's the ROI for this? I've seen a project just recently that's going to be millions and millions of dollars, and people are excited about it because it's this cool new technology feature or capability. But for $40 million, I'm pretty sure if you went and asked the taxpayer, would you like to spend the $40 million on that? or 40 million on something else, I almost guarantee they'd say on something else. We have to understand, is the return on investment good? So that for the money we put in, are we really going to get higher quality, a little bit or a lot more capacity, a little or a lot, much more market share? I mean, what are we going to get for this? And we need to start thinking about that right at the beginning to help us prioritize. So these are questions we really believe the business should be doing and working on before IT even sets up anything. Now, I know in the Agile world with user stories and things like that, a lot of this work happens, but I would even step back a bit, because I've seen one risk in not just Agile, but waterfall or anyone. We get really into local optimization, and I'll talk about that into a second. So we've really got to step back and see the big system. What are we working on, so we know we're working on the right thing? So let me give you a real life example here. A state appropriated a couple $2 million to build a new data platform. So all the servers needed to be bought and configured, et cetera, for the criminal courts and justice system, which it includes the prison, the court system, law enforcement, you can imagine. And it was just a promise to collect all this data so people can do awesome data analytics and just have data, right? Because we just want data. But we know data is there to exist to solve a problem, to help us answer questions. So here's the system. This is a generic flow. Now, this is a multifaceted system, right? Just fixing the courts is its own thing. Fixing the prison is its own thing. There's lots of aspects to this, but let's just start at the very high level. And I'll tell you why we start at the high level. If you were in the city of New York, you've never been there before, and you were just walking around the streets, it would be hard to find your way. At least for me, it'd be kind of hard to see how I can get from here to there. But if you're flying above it and looking down, you could much easier see the connections. And when we get stuck or things feel hard, our tendency is to go deeper, to get into the weeds. But what we're saying is no, go up a level. We've got to see the bigger system. We've got to build the blueprint for the house before we actually start constructing it. So even if you're assigned something small, we really encourage people to go bigger, because I don't want to fix one piece of the system that in the long run isn't going to work or flow with the rest of the system. So in this case, very simple, very high level flow, right? We said one of the things to do in those first questions is, what's the flow of work? There's an arrest. There's a decision about bail, goes to the court. The judge makes a decision. Is the person innocent, released to the community, or going to prison or supervision? And the person goes and gets those services, or they're released, and then hopefully they're rehabilitated, because most of the people in prison, 95%, usually about that number, are going to come back in to community. Very high level flow. Now, people are really well intended, and they are doing the job they are given to do. And so the tech people followed the mandate and said, let's start building up all the data, all the servers and the data elements and the structure, and spend about 2 years. It's a really big system to start setting this up. So what do you think at the end of 2 years, the impact was for this massive initiative that required technology to access tons of data across these different groups? What do you think the impact was? 148. Okay. Okay. Basically, the answer was 0. And why was that? Who's the primary customer here? It's the offender, or the person who's accused, going through the system, right? That's what we've got to figure out here. This person's going through the system. Law enforcement has no time when they're pushing somebody, not when they're grabbing somebody or arresting them. I'm using the wrong language. They're arresting one to look at a data system to see anything. They don't have time for that. They even told us that. They said, we don't have time for that. There's a point here in this process. Now, this is this system. I'm not saying this is true for every state, but in this one state, the judge, for example, has to have all the information to make a good decision. Because if the decision isn't made well or takes a long time, people are stuck in the jail system waiting for a trial, or the judge can make a wrong decision. And then a person is in the system when they shouldn't be in the system, incredibly expensive, $35,000 to $40,000 a year per person in the prison system. Or they sentence them, but it's the inappropriate sentence because they didn't have all the information. So now I'm like, I've got a real problem to solve. The problem is, how do I get the judge all the information the judge needs when he or she needs it, so they can make the most informed decision? Now, that's a problem to solve. That's a primary problem to solve. Now I can go set up a data system around that. And we can go on and on. But just asking these basic questions can help all the complexity of this stuff, boil it down, help us focus, actually make a difference, and then we can move to the next problem. So Randy says we have some questions here. Let's hear some questions.
Let's do just use close real quick.
Yeah. So I threw a lot at you, but if I were going to sum this up, it is this: technology is amazing, but it's a tool. Just because it's just the latest trend or the coolest thing doesn't mean we need to jump on it. Anchor into your primary problem for your primary customer. Understand what's blocking the customer, understanding what's going on in the system, so you can build around that and create a system that works together. There's a lot of things that goes into that, but even having, just being relentless about that can start to make a big difference. Lane, okay.
It says, as a developer, I'm several levels removed from my direct customers. Even when I work in small companies with no middle management, the game of telephone is even worse in larger companies. How do I learn and understand the customer's needs in spite of all this?
Really good question, Lane. Yeah, how do you know the primary customer's needs in spite of all this? So a couple, because I get that, like, you're here and the people up here don't. Sometimes just a couple suggestions, and other people here may have some ideas. One, asking really good questions for those you're developing. So you may have a supervisor you've got maybe 3 layers between you and the CEO, but you can even start figuring out for your own little world, who's your primary customer. Now, the organization needs to be focused on the primary customer ultimately. But as you practice and start with this, you could even just start with, who's my primary customer? Maybe right now you're going to practice with it's your supervisor. And this is how you grow in your career, right? What's a real problem my supervisor has, and how can I solve that? But I'd also then, you can do some basic research, and you can think very common sense. A lot of people are like, we got to do all this market research to understand our customers. I disagree with that. I think you can find insights for sure. But when Steve Jobs built the product, I think, of Apple, many of you probably know his story. It's like, I don't need to go research and survey people for stuff they may not even know exists. Henry Ford was famous for saying, if I have surveyed people on what they wanted, they would want a faster horse. Now, what I mean by that is, you can think about, if you were the customer, whatever product your company is doing, just ask yourself, who do you think their primary customer is? Who do you think it should be? What do you think the primary need for that customer would be? And just start asking yourself that question, so you can start getting anchored. And then when work comes to you, you can start helping shape the discussion by just asking the question, hey, who are we really trying to help here? And do we think this is going to make a big difference? So not simple. I know it takes some time, and when you're deeper in the organization, it feels more difficult, but you don't have to do tons of market research to do this. Just put yourself in the customer's shoes and just think, what would they really, really want or need? And start there.
There's another one from Sarah.
Sarah, okay.
She says she works in IT, and we generally consider the company's employees to be our customers. But the company as a whole is focused on providing an important service to external people. Is IT focused on the wrong customer, or is it valid to have our own customer subset?
So that's a really good question, Sarah. When I go back to that scoping piece, is this mission driven or administrative? That's why that's really important, because you'll likely have two, like you said, you have your external customer. But I want to always start there, and here's why. Because we can get very crazy busy with internal customer, like new intranet sites, I read one article recently where they were trying to make their own intranet internal site like Netflix, so that people could stuff would pop up to them of what they think they need. I'm like, the first thing is, you've got too many policies and procedures if you need a Netflix type capability to sort through all of them, right? So again, it always goes back to the business problem, not the IT problem. So yes, you will, but internal products become lost because we're not focused on the primary customer. I want alignment there. If I want an internal customer and they need a data report, the first question to me is, what data do they need and why? How is this going to help them solve the primary customer's problem, understand the flow, why work is getting stuck, what the profitability is, et cetera. If an internal customer wants, an HR data analytics on, retention rates or something like that, I again go back to the primary customer. This is how I work, but I've had experience in a lot of different spaces in this. I'm asking the question, what can we first do to reduce retention? Because how we're delivering services to the primary customer is burning our people out. So are we, and often I find the high correlation between how we're delivering the service to our customer and how we're expecting people to work in a very chaotic environment, which is contributing to burnout. So I find those internal and external customers, not all the time, but often correlated. So when you even have an internal project, I'd still ask myself, and you know, sometimes you're given work and you've got to do it. You know, you do it. We can do it. There's a whole different webinar just on how do you accelerate work once you've been assigned the work, right? A lot of time and effort is spent, how do I accelerate? But we're asking even up front, what do I do? And I always want to correlate as much as I can. I want to get the biggest bang for the buck I can. So if I'm doing an internal project, can I also make it work for the external customer at the same time? What's the correlation? How do they connect? Not everything's that way, but the much as I can solve both problems at the same time I want to.
We have 3 minutes.
Okay, 3
And
minutes.
Vishal, who just spoke, he had a good comment, great comment.
He's reading me your comment real
He
quick.
says, I love this because he said it helps us get away from the wishful thinking and bring the customer central back into real focus.
Yeah, thank you. I do too. It's common sense, but we can lose our way a lot of times in the complexity and the chaos of what's being thrown at us. Okay. Well, it was so fun being with you. I know I threw a lot, and it can, you know, I don't want you to all feel overwhelmed and you've got to do all this now. In your own work, regardless of where you stand in your organization, right? At CEO or frontline, just keep anchoring back into this question: who's my primary customer? Now, if you're on the front line and you're like, hey, I'm developer, I'm too detached, I can't make the impact. Still stay anchored there, right? I stayed anchored in that, working with the legislature, whatever, because I needed my own internal compass. And secondly, part of this work is who can I serve, right? Who can I serve? And so you may practice again with just, as Sarah said earlier, maybe you do have an internal customer and that's where you really want to practice solving a real problem for them. There's a whole art to problem solving. I wish we had a little more time and I could show you how to build out some of the thinking tools for that to help you really think through the conflict or the problem people are facing. But simple's better. Impact's made when we solve real problems for real people. So thanks for letting me spend time with you today. All the best.